Good day, everyone. My name is James Lafayette. Many of you may already know my story, but there are probably many more of you that know of me because of my last name, Lafayette. They may be wondering why I took that name in the first place. To be able to tell that story, I have to begin 43 years ago in 1781. I was owned by a man by the name of William Armistead. I was his manservant. He was the commissary or the head of the public stores, the public warehouses in Williamsburg. Goods were shipped in and shipped out to that warehouse, mostly because we were at war. It was for the Continental Army. There was a shipment that I was to deliver to the Marquis de Lafayette. It ended up being the first time I met him. And what was unusual was that the Marquis began to ask me questions about my life. Other than my family, no one had ever asked me about my life before. As a matter of fact, he was very interested in the fact that I was a slave and asked me at what age did I know that I was a slave? I looked at him and I said, I was born in 1748, but the first memories I have in my life are of 1752, 1753, maybe being 4 or 5 years old. And all I can remember from that time is knowing that something in my life wasn't right. But you know, when you're 4 or 5 years old, you don't know how to express those feelings in words, do you? You whine or you cry or you get angry. That's how a 4 or 5-year-old shows their feelings, isn't it? Well, if we're being honest with ourselves, some adults still do that. But it wasn't until I became an adult that I was able to put into words what I had been feeling as that 5-year-old child. And it was this. There's one great gift that the Lord God above has given to every man, woman, and child on this earth, and it is our free will. And what sort of relationship can you have with your God when man, not God, has taken that away from you? Even at 5 years old, I knew that a great gift had been stripped away from me. And I was angry. He asked me about my upbringing, asked me about my education, and I'd said that I had been educated with Master William. It meant I learned my reading, my writing, my numbers. He said, oh, it must be so wonderful to be so educated. And I said, not necessarily. The best way I can put it is that as a slave, I was property. I have a certain monetary value, yes? What happens if you have a piece of property and something is added to that property? It becomes worth more money, doesn't it? Knows how to read, worth more money. Knows how to write, worth more money. Knows their numbers, worth more money. Very quickly, I became one of the most lucrative pieces of property that Master William owned. And should he ever need to sell off any of his property in order to, say, pay off debts, as we are all in debt, well, most likely I could be one of the first pieces of property that he would sell off. Now, don't get me wrong. Education is a beautiful gift. It helps us to understand ourselves. It helps us to understand the world that is around us. But to the enslaved, it is also a double-edged sword. And I needed for the Marquis de Lafayette to understand that fact. He continued to talk to me for a while. But it wasn't until some days later that I understood why. Master William comes into the public stores not long after with this very perplexed look on his face, and he asks, well, and he looks at me, and I ask him, why do you look so perplexed? And he said, well, James, the Marquis de Lafayette has made a very unusual request of me, and I'm not sure what to do about it. And I ask him, well, what does he ask of you? And William Armistead looks at me and he says, the Marquis de Lafayette has asked if I'd be willing to allow you to serve under him in the Continental Army. Now I gave Master William that sideways look. You know that sideways look you give someone when they say something that just doesn't make any sense to you? My wife Sylvia gives me that look on a daily basis. It's this look. But William simply shrugged his shoulders and said, attend to the Marquis. Find out what it is that he wants. I think that I'm going to grant this request of his. So I found the Marquis de Lafayette once again, and I said, what is it that you intend of me? I'm no soldier. And he said, "But James, I'm not asking you to serve the Continental Army as a soldier with a musket in your hand. You are a very clever and intelligent man. What I want for you to do, James, I want you to sneak across the British lines as a fake runaway slave. Ingratiate yourself with the officers of the British Army and serve them as a serving man, because that is what you do. Listen to their conversations as you are serving them and report what you hear back to me." And I said, "So you want me to be your spy?" And he said, "Yes, James, that's exactly what I want." Then I gave him that sideways look. I said, "How do you expect me to spy?" And he said, "But James, were you not the one that talked of the invisible people of Williamsburg?" And what that had meant, he asked me about the makeup of Williamsburg. And in 1781, I explained to him, Williamsburg was a town of a little under 2,000 people. And out of those under 2,000 people, more than 1,000 of us were slaves, more than half the population. But the truth of the matter is that most people, though we were right in front of their faces, didn't even notice that we were around unless they needed something. But we were serving the food. We were pouring the drinks. We were delivering the correspondence. It meant that we were everywhere. We saw everything. We heard everything. We knew everything. I explained that to the Marquis, and he had remembered that. So, of course, I asked him the next question that someone in my lot would ask. Am I going to gain my own freedom by serving this American cause of freedom? The Marquis looked down, he sighed, pauses for a moment, and he says, "James, I am no friend to slavery, as you know, but that is not an offer that I can even by law make to you. I hope that the Americans will see it in their hearts to give you your freedom for your contributions to their cause, but I am not allowed to make you that offer, that guarantee." I realized I had two choices. The first choice, well, some of you sitting there may say I had three choices, but that third choice, the choice to say, "No, thank you," was not a choice that I could conceivably make. I was owned by Master William. He could compel me to do his bidding, and I do not think he would allow me to slight so important a man as the Marquis de Lafayette by saying no to him. So here were my two choices. The first choice was to do as the Marquis de Lafayette wanted, make my way across British lines and then return in order to spy for him. Understand how dangerous this undertaking would be. If I were to be discovered, I would immediately be put to death for what I was doing. But there was a second choice that I had. I could make my way across British lines and simply stay there. The British were offering freedom to slaves that made their way and joined the British Army. So ask yourself this question. If you were me, my position, my lot, with those two very difficult choices, which choice would you make? Freedom with the British, perhaps? God save the king, perhaps? But it is always, always more complicated than just, do you want to be free or do you not want to be free? There were other questions that were even far more important. The first one was, which side could I actually trust to keep their word? Couldn't trust the British. For being honest with ourselves, the British were the ones that brought us over as slaves in the first place. They weren't freeing me out of the kindness of their hearts. They were freeing me because they had a use for me, and that I understood. But on the other hand, I couldn't trust the Americans either. They had written these documents, the Declaration of Independence, Virginia Declaration of Rights. They talk about the natural rights of man being that of freedom. And I was still a slave to some of the very same men that had helped make those documents possible. I couldn't trust the Americans either. And at that moment, I thought to myself, maybe, just maybe, I could trust the Marquis de Lafayette. He's a Frenchman. But I also believed that he was honest and he was honorable in his words and in his deeds. But that wasn't even the most important question that I had to ask myself. The most important question was, what would happen to my family if I was to run off and stay with the British. I would not be able to take them with me. Their master would probably think that they knew that I was leaving and had something to do with it. They would be punished severely for what I had done. They would probably be sold off and I would never see them again. So the question for me was this, and I'm going to ask you to think about it as well. Is freedom, but without your family, without those around you that you love, would you truly consider that freedom? I wouldn't. I couldn't imagine freedom without my wife, Sylvia. I don't even want to think about freedom without the opportunity to have my children by my side. And I knew the choice at that moment that I needed to make. And it was the choice that I did make. I spied for the Marquis de Lafayette, hoping that when this war was over, I would be granted my freedom for my contributions to the American cause. And I made my way across British lines. And at first, I was serving Benedict Arnold. But apparently, I had done such good work that I was called into the officer's tent, and I go inside there, and I'm expecting to hear Benedict Arnold talking to me, and it's not Benedict Arnold. It is instead the head of all the Southern British forces, General Lord Cornwallis himself. Now, I'm thinking in my head, why would such an important man as General Lord Cornwallis have any need to even speak to a lowly soldier such as myself? Unless I'd been discovered, I thought. He approaches me. He says, "James, there's something we'd like for you to do for us. You are a very clever and intelligent man. What we'd like for you to do, we'd like for you to sneak across the continental lines, ingratiate yourself with the officers of the Continental Army, and serve them as a serving-man, because that is what you do. Listen to their conversations as you are serving them, and report what you hear back to me." And I said, "So you want me to be your spy?" And he said, "Yes, James, that is exactly what I want." And then I gave him that sideways look. What were the chances? He had no idea that's exactly what I had been doing to him right underneath his nose, spying on him. Yet they had taken such a notice of the work that I had done for them that now they wanted me to spy for them. You can't write this. I made the choice. I would make my way to the American forces and share what British information I knew, and then I would return to the British forces with misinformation. Probably the most important piece of information that I shared with the American forces was the news that Cornwallis was, in fact, heading to Yorktown. And we all know how that battle turned out, don't we? It wasn't the final battle of the war, but it was the decisive victory that Americans needed to know that we would have our freedom and our independence from Great Britain, and I had helped. After that time, the Marquis de Lafayette returned to France, and I returned home under Master William, hopefully to soon gain my own freedom. There's so much more of my life that I could talk to you about here, but I understand that you may have questions, and it may be better, far better, for you to ask the questions that you may want to know about my life growing up or my life in the subsequent 40 years since I spied for the Marquis de Lafayette. So I am happy to take this time now to answer any queries that you might have for me.
Thank you, Mr. Lafayette. You talked for a bit in the beginning about your life as a child and realizing when your free will had been stripped from you. Can you talk a little bit about gaining that free will back, gaining your life as a free man? Were you given freedom because of your contributions to the American cause?
It's a very good question. No, not at first. Upon the Marquis de Lafayette returning to France, the Virginian legislature did issue legislation giving freedom to enslaved soldiers who had served in place of their masters. Because I had not carried a musket or wore a uniform, They did not consider me a soldier, and I had not served in place of William Armistead. As far as they were concerned, I had volunteered to serve the Marquis de Lafayette. Therefore, as a lawyer put it to me, through a technicality of law, I was not to be given my freedom for my contributions to American liberty and independence. I was sent back to slavery. I was sent back to Master William. And the years passed. 1783, Treaty of Paris is signed. America has its freedom and its independence. And I don't have mine. The Marquis de Lafayette in 1784 returns to America, and he finds out that I am still enslaved, and he is livid. And he actually writes a letter to the Virginia legislature telling them of what I had done, saying that I deserved my freedom for it. And do you know, despite that letter from the Marquis, at first nothing happened. It took 2 more years. 1786, I drafted my own petition for manumission, for freedom. And I attached that letter from the Marquis de Lafayette. And the legislature said that it was mostly due to that letter from the Marquis de Lafayette from 1784 that in 1787 I was granted my freedom for my contributions to American independence. By then I was nearly 40 years old, but I had the sweet taste of freedom on my lips. And it tasted so good. And I had a lot more work to do. But yes, it took me 6 years after serving with the Marquis de Lafayette of defending this country before I was finally granted my freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Lafayette. And that last question was from Sloan. Our next question also deals with your time as a spy. And Julie wants to know, were you almost caught?
I like to say that great spies are great because no one ever knows that they existed. Was I a great spy? No. But I was a fairly good spy. There's so much information that I learned and that I used that I've never been able to share, and I don't know that I ever will. But there are numerous stories about spies during that time. I'm going to share one with you. Is it one of my stories? Maybe. I was making my way, and I can't remember if I was making my way from the British forces or from the American forces. At that point, I was a double spy. I was making my way between both. But I was crossing a road, and there was a field. And as I'm crossing the road, I hear off in the distance, "Halt! What are you about? What are you doing?" I look down the road, and it's dusk, so I can barely see, but there are 2 silhouettes in the distance. I can't tell whether they're American or whether they're British forces. No idea. I cannot see the colors. And I'm thinking to myself, what can I do? "Halt!" once again is said to me. "What are you about?" I look around, and I see that maybe about 50 yards down the way is a wooded area. And I'm wondering how fast I can make my way from the edge of the road to that wooded area. And for the 3rd time, I hear, "Halt! What are you about?" And I wasn't about to tell them what I was about. I made my way as quickly as possible to that wooded area. I could hear them lower their guns, and they fired. I'm very lucky that they were using muskets and not rifles. For those of you that don't know the difference between a musket and a rifle, it is often said that if you want to prevent yourself from being hit by a musket ball, stand directly in front of the musket. They are extremely inaccurate. Rifles, though, because of the design of their barrels and of the bullet itself, are extremely accurate. And had they had rifles, most likely that first volley would have ended me. But the other thing that I knew at that moment is I had 15 seconds at least to make my way from where I heard that volley to the wooded area. Why 15 seconds? Because even the best marksman can only reload his musket 4 times per minute, which meant I had 15 seconds before the next volley. I don't know how I did it. But in 15 seconds, I was where I needed to be in that wooded area. And the next volley came, they had no idea where I was. That was the closest I came to being caught, at least before the war ended? It's a very good question.
That's a terrifying situation.
Indeed.
You said that you were not a very good spy, but I think you must have been a fairly great one to spy on and for both sides during this most recent war.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Smith, for saying so.
I don't know if you feel comfortable answering this next question, but Janine would like to know, what are some of the things you heard or might have heard while spying on the British for the American side?
That's a very good question. And I am going to partly answer this, but there are certain things that I'm not going to say because we are in polite company. Children, women. I want to make sure that I am not saying things that would take you for granted. So I will not talk about many of the things that these rough soldiers would say when I was serving them. Understand, they were talking to each other as if there was no one else around. And that meant that I heard absolutely everything from stories about their wives and their children, stories about their time in England, stories about what they were doing here in America, why they were even here, whether they wanted to be here or not. Some of the most interesting pieces I heard were pieces of information that were not used for spycraft at all. When you're in a room and you're invisible, as many of us who were enslaved often were, you learn about human nature. You learn about people. You learn about what they consider to be important in their lives. And you learn in many ways how to make sure they are not completely aware of who you are or what you're capable of. Takes us a little bit off the subject of what you asked, but most of what I heard were those personal things. Having said that, of course, hearing a conversation of Cornwallis making his way to Yorktown, when they were going to go somewhere else and they were debating amongst the generals as to what they were going to do and that final decision was going to be made, I would be standing there in that room and I would get to hear those debates, and they were sometimes heated because it was war. But so much is said when people think they are not being heard.
We have a question from Nathan about Cornwallis.
Sure.
Do you know if he ever discovered, perhaps after Yorktown, that you were actually on the American side during this thing?
That brings up a very interesting story. After the Battle of Yorktown and Cornwallis's surrender, it's often customary for the defeated general to visit the victorious general, which meant that Cornwallis would be making his way to visit the Marquis de Lafayette. And it is also customary for that victorious general to have all of his staff behind him to greet this defeated general. What that meant was that as General Cornwallis was making his way to the Marquis de Lafayette, I am standing directly behind the Marquis de Lafayette. I was unbelievably nervous. Cornwallis comes to greet the Marquis, and he sees me, and he approaches me. I was shaking. I was unbelievably nervous. So I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of, "You rascal, you have made a mischief of me." And that is how General Cornwallis found out that I had been spying against him.
You rascal, you have made a mischief of me.
Indeed.
And in that moment, perhaps he realized exactly how the siege, how the information was given.
Indeed.
Deborah wants to know about your time as a slave and why your master did not grant you freedom when slave laws relaxed in Virginia in the 1780s.
That is a very good question. I would say you would have to ask William on that, though he is no longer with us, and he and I never spoke of it. I have thoughts on that, and I'm happy to share them with you. William Armistead might not have known at the time the actual work I was doing for the Marquis de Lafayette. He probably thought I was serving him as a serving man. But upon the end of my service with the Marquis de Lafayette, William became very aware of the work that I had done for the Marquis de Lafayette. And no, he did not give me my freedom at the time. If I was going to be given my freedom for meritorious service to the state, well, then the Virginia legislature would have to grant me my freedom. What was always interesting to me was during that time, those 6 years of me hopefully gaining my freedom, William Armistead was also a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. He could have put something forward for me to be freed. He could have saw that I had been given my freedom for my contributions, and he did not. I think that the reason why he did not grant me my freedom for another 6 years, and the legislature had to do it, is because if William had freed me, he would not have been compensated the sum of my worth for freeing me. The only way he would get anything for freeing me would be to make the state do it. And when the state freed me, they did. They paid him the sum of my worth, $250, in order to grant my freedom from William Armistead. I never spoke to him about it because after I gained my freedom, we both had no reason with which to speak to each other. And though we lived miles from each other, I didn't see much of him after that, nor did I need to. But we never spoke on it. So I can't answer it for sure, but I truly do think that was a big reason why he did not free me when he had the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Lafayette. We have several questions about your family. You've spoken of your wife and your children. Can you tell us about your wife and your children?
Yes. My children are all now grown, and my wife, Sylvia, even after all these years, is still my wonderful helpmate. But it didn't start that way upon me gaining my freedom. I was only granted my freedom. My wife and my children were not granted theirs for the service that I had done. I had to find work, I had to find a place to live, and then I had to save up enough money to buy my wife and buy my children from their master. And that's when matters got even more complicated. And what I mean by that is that slave laws are not written with freed blacks in mind. They are written with white slaveholders in mind because they are the majority. What that meant was when I was finally able to buy my children from their master, under Virginia law, I was not allowed to free them. Virginia law at that time stated that if you were going to free an enslaved person that was under the age of majority, adulthood, you could not free them unless you put enough money aside for them to be taken care of so that the state would not have to foot that burden. I would never have enough money to put aside in trust for that, which meant that until they reached their adulthood, I had to own, on paper, my own children. Now, some may say, well, you didn't treat them as slaves within your home. Well, of course I didn't. But understand what it means under the law. I'll put it in this manner. Let's say that something bad should happen to you, or to your spouse, or to a family member, and they had debts. What happens? The state sells off your property in order to pay off your debts, don't they? And what would be the most expensive pieces of property that the state would sell off in order to pay off my debts? It would be my children. My children would be sold off in order to pay off my debts. I would not have it on to my worst enemy to have to own your own children. I was lucky, though. My children were able to reach their majority, and they all now have lives of their own, and they are free. My wife, Sylvia, because the rule also applies to slaves that you want to free over the age of 45, but though she would not want me to tell you her age. She was under the age of 45 then, and I was able to free her the moment that I bought her. But those slave laws are complicated, and even as a freed black man in Virginia, those laws are complicated. I am not given the same equal protections under the law that a white man has. Under the Virginia Constitution, I'm not given those rights, which means that my life has to be lived in a somewhat different manner than a free person that is, well, not black.
Thank you. We have a few questions about your income currently and your life after the war. Wendy and Carl all want to know about the acreage that you bought. What do you do with it, and what is your primary source of income at this moment?
Well, when I first was freed, I took a job at a local grist mill in New Kent County. I was educated, but I was not going to be hired to a job that required me or that would let me use that education. Most jobs that would have required me to write things or to record things, this is where I talk about the law, in essence, from the earlier question. In essence, the things that are written down have to be legally binding. And because I'm not allowed to testify in court against a white person, that means that much of what I would write would not be admissible in court, or at least I would not be able to vouch for the validity of those things. So for the first few years of my freedom, I was a laborer at the local grist mill. I was eventually able to save up enough money to buy 40 acres of land in New Kent County. Now, understand that that land was derelict. The land most likely had been used for tobacco. And anyone who has planted tobacco knows that tobacco destroys your land. And if you feel like you have an unlimited amount of land to use, well, you're not going to do anything to help replenish that land to continue growing your tobacco. You're going to grow as much tobacco as you can because of how much money it makes you. Allow that land to eventually be destroyed, and then you move on. What that means, though, is that those of us that are looking for a place to just grow simple crops enough to feed our families, we can buy that land, and it doesn't cost very much to do so. I was very lucky. It was on the water. I was able to build a house there. It's actually not far from the James City County line. And I lived there in that 40 acres with my family, working the land. And that worked for a time until around about 1818. And now I can't find the same work that I used to. I now travel for work. I travel as far as sometimes to Baltimore to find jobs, to find work that I can do to continue to support myself and continue to support my wife, Sylvia. My children are living their own lives, and because of many of the laws, some of my family members that I freed are not allowed to return to Virginia, which means I don't honestly get to see them as much, nor can they help me in the way that they might want to. It's unfortunate, but I'd rather them be free. But that is where I am in my life now, and where I was in my life when I was freed.
Mr. Lafayette, we have several questions here left on the slate, and the next round of questions we want to devote to the children's questions. So I was wondering, we have several of them, if we could do somewhat of a rapid round children question call and response. Is that all right with you?
Perfect. I would love to.
All right. So Clara, age 9, wants to know, what was your relationship with Lafayette like?
A true friend. It is not often, and I can't think of anyone else, with whom I had any sort of interaction with during my time of being enslaved, who looked at me and talked to me as if I was not a slave. The Marquis did that. Yes, I was his subordinate, but he treated me like any other soldier that was serving under him. I was not used to that. And even today, I consider him to be a dear, dear friend.
Thank you, Mr. Lafayette. Violet and John both want to know not about the information that you secured from the British, but maybe what false information did you give to the British?
I wish I could answer that question longer, but to answer it as concisely as I can, much of the information that I delivered to the British lines was actually true. Misinformation is not giving lies, it's giving just enough true information to make it seem useful, but not enough to make it actually be useful. So I would share the troop numbers of how many men the Marquis de Lafayette has, or where they're going to be heading to next. And I would give them just enough information to know that it was accurate, but not enough information to allow them to get that upper hand on the American forces. It was quite the tightrope walk, and I'm very lucky that it ended the way that it did.
Thank you. William and Madeline, aged 11 and 9, want to know a little bit about your middle and last name.
James Armistead Lafayette. I don't often use the Armistead. I took the name Lafayette upon being freed in 1787. I could have picked any last name I wanted. I had no last name. I hadn't thought about what my last name would be, but when I thought about who in my life helped me with the opportunities to gain my freedom, of a name that I would always want to remember being connected to myself and those that come after me, I couldn't think of a better one than Lafayette. And say it yourselves, young ones. It's a wonderful word to say, Lafayette. So that last name works in that manner. The Armistead I keep because you always should know where you came from. Though when I was owned by William Armistead, I was never known as James Armistead. I think knowing and being able to understand where you came from helps you better to know where you're going.
Well, we certainly enjoy Lafayette around here. He has a lovely singing voice. Did you know that?
I have heard that. I have not heard him sing in about 40 years, but I do remember him being as a songbird.
Well, that's one way to describe it. We have a question from MV, and this person wants to know, what is it like growing up a slave, and did your master treat you all right?
That's a really good question. It's not a question that I feel is fair for me to answer. Instead, I'm going to give you the circumstances, and I'm going to have you answer the question on your own. To begin with, I knew that my life was not my own at a very early age, as I mentioned earlier. And that did make me angry, and that did make me feel helpless. So, young ones, in your life, who has say over where you go and what you do? And you're all probably going to say, my parents. They have say in where you go and where you do by law until when? Until you reach your adulthood, correct? How would you feel if even when you reached your adulthood, your parents continued to have, under the letter of the law, control over where you go, what you do, whether you live, whether you die, whether you can openly love? If they had that control over you when you're 20, 30, 40, 50, but on top of that, even if they came to you and said, don't worry, I'm going to be so kind to you as long as you do everything I say, how would that make you feel? And how would you feel about that person who continues to have that control over every bit of your being, despite how kind they are being to you? Would you resent them? Would you hate them? I'm not here to answer that question for you, but I do want you to explore those questions and figure out for yourself, how would that make you feel? And then ask yourself this: is it possible for someone who has complete and total control over who you are and what you do for the rest of your life, is it possible to look at them as being kind to you, even though they have taken the one thing that, according to this country, God has given to us all, our freedom? That's the question that you should ask yourself, and hopefully you'll be able to figure out your answer. But I don't know that it would be right of me to answer that question myself.
We know that Lafayette has returned on a grand tour to this continent. Were you able to see him on his return visit? That's
Yes.
a question from Carolyn, by the way.
Carolyn, beautiful question. It just happened yesterday, actually. I was in Richmond. I was hoping to see him in Yorktown on Yorktown Day. Unfortunately, I did not have enough money to be properly equipped, as I said to the newspaper reporter, to be able to make my way to Yorktown to see the Marquis. So instead, I walked to Richmond. And I was in the crowd of the parade down the main street of Richmond where the Marquis was making his way on his carriage. He saw me, I don't know how, in the audience. And even after 40 years, he knew exactly who I was. He stopped the carriage. He jumped out of the carriage, and he gave me the largest embrace that I had in a long time in the middle of the streets of Richmond. And the Richmonders had no idea what to do with themselves. And of course, he greeted me in that European fashion. Mwah, mwah. Well, because he's the Marquis. Mwah, mwah. And we cried, we wept together to see a dear friend after 40 years, both of us free, him still alive, after what happened in the French Revolution. We were able to talk afterwards as well. We talked and learned about our lives and our family. I mourned with him over the loss of his wife because I did not get to mourn with him when it happened. It was a beautiful evening of talking and drinking and enjoying the company of someone who truly looked at you as a person. Yesterday was one of the most beautiful days of my life, short of my children being born and my marriage to my wife. So yes, I did get to see him again, and it was actually quite recently.
It's lovely when you can sit across from someone and relive not just the old days that you had together, but think about the future and think about your lives and Americans' lives and the lives of the people around the world going forward. And at some point you talk about legacy. We're going to give our last question of the day in this lovely conversation with you, sir, to Jonathan. And he would like to know, what hope do you have for a distant future generation, for your family in the future? What would you like for people to say about you when you're gone? What would you like your legacy, sir, to be?
Beautiful question, Jonathan. My legacy is simple. New Kent County is my home, which means Virginia is my home, which means the United States of America is my home. The law may say that I would not be considered a citizen of this Commonwealth or a citizen of this nation because of the color of my skin. But I know the land. It is my home. I fought for this country. I nearly died for this country. And there must come a day where those who are still enslaved in the way that I was will have their freedom. I hope that my legacy is that those around who have the power to change themselves as well as the way in which this country functions will look at the contributions of myself and so many others that look like me, and will hopefully know that we are citizens of this country. We want to love this country. It is where we are born. It is where I want to die. My legacy for my family is that they live happy lives and that they are allowed to have the opportunity to truly bask in that freedom on which this country was first founded. For those that come after me who are not even in my family, I hope that the day will come when we all look at ourselves as American, that we have laughed together, fought together, died together, cried together. And through that, hopefully we've gained understanding. Hopefully through that I've gained brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, and aunts and uncles. They don't have to look like me, but they can be my countrymen. I hope that my legacy is that I leave this world just a bit better than it was when I was here. We all want that for our children, don't we? I hope we all want that for this world. That's what legacy means to me. That's what I want my legacy to be. Thank you so much for all of these questions, for allowing me this time to speak with you, for allowing me this time to share my story. There's an old African proverb that says that you are never forgotten if people share your story, if people speak your name. I can hope that my name continues to be spoken centuries after I am gone. I hope that the sacrifices that we made will continue to be remembered and spoken upon even long after we're gone, and I hope that it helps others to understand what it truly means to be a citizen. But hopefully in talking with you all here, having this time, we at least can understand each other a little bit better. Good day to you all, and take care.